Andy Agathangelou. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise, which means very simply that we exist to make an impact as opposed to making a profit. We have a formal mission statement, which we must have as a certified social enterprise. And that mission statement is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. And we go about our work in many different ways. We run events, we engage with the media, we engage with parliamentarians, we run an all-party parliamentary group, we write white papers, we do research, we lobby, we basically do everything we can to try to get the financial industry to work the way that it ought to. Over the last 7 years, since I've been running the Transparency Task Force, I've become increasingly convinced that the financial regulator, the FCA in the UK, is as big a part of the problem as it is a solution. And that's borne out for many, many good reasons. I stress that point because everything we do is very much evidence-based. We are an evidence-based organisation, and very frankly and very bluntly, the evidence really does suggest that there is something seriously, seriously wrong with the Financial Conduct Authority. And I hope that you would agree with me that last night's Panorama programme really does support the notion that there really is something seriously wrong with the Financial Conduct Authority. We'll be doing a couple of kind of exercises during the course of the session. The first one is going to start in just a moment. I'm going to invite all of you, please, to write the 1, 2, or 3 words that best describes how you feel as a consequence of having watched that program. What is the 1, 2, or 3 words that best describes how you feel as a consequence of having watched the program last night? I'll put that in the chat in just a moment. We've still got people coming through. Gosh, what a tremendously good turnout. Tremendously good turnout. So what 1, 2, or 3 words best describes how you felt watching the program? You don't have to do this. We'll probably make a word cloud out of the responses we get. It's always very interesting to get feedback on these sorts of things. What 1, 2, or 3 words best describes how the program made you feel? This isn't scientific. It's not particularly analytical. It's just to give everybody a chance to express how they feel. And there's quite a lot of pretty emotive words in there. I'm not actually surprised by that. I'm not surprised at that at all. Okay. After I've sort of set the scene, we're going to pass to Paul Carlier, who's got some further thoughts about the programme, what it covered, some other bits it didn't cover, and we'll then go to Mark Bishop, who's going to be articulating Transparency Task Force's ideas about what we should now do. In general terms, what we should now do is captured by what we call our strategy for driving change. And our strategy for driving change is written down. It's a formal strategy. Our strategy for driving change is all about the idea that we basically need to bring together the thinking of 2 types of people. On one hand, there are people like me and the other campaigners and our members who we would characterize as having a sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see. And on the other hand, there's another group of people equally important. These are those people that we characterize as having the power and the position to make change possible. And that group, of course, includes policymakers, regulators, and politicians. And we've made it our business over the last 6 or 7 years or so to work closely with and support and engage with politicians, because politicians have the power to make new legislation. And because they have the power to make new legislation, they really are in a good place to mandate the kind of changes that we want to see. So if you haven't done it yet, please do put the 1, 2, or 3 words that express how the program made you feel into the chat. Feel also free to use the chat to circulate any thoughts, comments, questions you have. We will be circulating the chat in due course. There's also going to be some letters that we're going to be talking about. We'll probably circulate those in the next few days. There's no rush on that. We will probably do that in the next few days. And the letters are all about you guys doing something that is going to help the cause. Okay, I hope that sets the scene enough. We've got a lot to come through or to go through. We're formally finishing at 1 o'clock, but I'll be very comfortable to finish later than that if people want to stay on for further Q&A and discussion. We'll try to make it as inclusive as the time allows us to, but there really is quite a bit to cover. So, Mr. Mark Bishop, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I'm going to be showing some slides. So the first thing I'm going to do is to arrange to share my screen. So I've entitled this How to Put Things Right, because putting things right implies two things. One is putting things right financially for the victims of Blackmore Bond and other regulatory failure cases. And the second one is how to put wider things right, basically the financial regulation ecosystem that we have. How can that be fixed? So let me first talk about the nature of the problem, and first the scale of it. And this is all by the FCA's own admission. This is direct from its own website. In 2020/21, it said that £569 million a year was being lost to financial scams. That was growing at 23% per year before COVID, and the FCA itself says that that rate has increased significantly since then. So it's probably a fair supposition that the annual run rate is about £1 billion per year, and that was the base case that was used by the TV production company when they made the claim in the title. So examples of a few that you've heard of: London Capital Finance, Connaught Income Fund Series 1, Bassett and Gold, Asset Life, Lendy, Collateral, Funding Secure. But there are many, many more than that. It's no exaggeration to say that you could run a panorama every week for a year on a financial scam, each of them with regulatory failure in it on a similar scale, and you would not have touched the sides. And this is also not including other things that I call non-scam regulatory failure cases. So it's not a fraudulent investment scheme. So bank mistreatment of SMEs is a good case. Mortgage prisoners, the people who are having to pay very high mortgage rates, the Woodford scandal, Premier FX, the building societies that got caught up with the Phillips Trust Corporation, and there are many, many more. So what are the underlying causes? Well, I'll be blunt. Wrongdoers are almost guaranteed to get away with it, and there is a perhaps willful regulatory underlap. So what is that underlap? Many rules that the FCA is supposed to police are largely not enforced. The FCA is not the lead prosecutor of fraud, the police are, but it has memorandums of understanding with the police and with action fraud, which cause those entities to report to the FCA when there is a financial services scam or alleged one that's brought to their attention. And generally the case transfers across to the FCA, and at that point it kind of dies. There is an easily exploited and allegedly unclear, though I personally disagree, regulatory perimeter. There are cap flaps within this, such as the appointed representatives regime, where an authorised firm can effectively allow a third party to act as if it were authorised, and often those are wrongdoers. Authorised firms can approve promotions to the unauthorised. That, of course, happened in this case, Blackmore Bond, or they can be selling unregulated products, and it's not clear that the product is unregulated. Sophistication tests, those are the ones that limit the sale of certain products to people who meet certain criteria, can easily be gamed. That also happened in Blackmore Bond. There is almost total absence of transparency, accountability, and of financial liability by the FCA for when it gets things wrong. And here is the result. Trust has declined across many sectors in recent years, but no more so than financial services. If you look on the left-hand side there, you'll see that it is trusted less than any other industry or sector in the UK, apart from social media. If you think about social media, it's almost totally unregulated. And, you know, a Russian bot, a tinfoil hat merchant with some bizarre theory about vaccines and 5G, and, you know, a predatory paedophile all operate on the same level and the same platform as the Pope. And that can't be right. Now, financial services are extensively regulated, they certainly are, and there are costs involved in compliance for many firms. But you have to ask the question, is this regulation effective as opposed to merely extensive? Perhaps actually less but better regulation might be a better outcome for all concerned, or at least for the honest majority in the industry and for consumers. So the root cause I propose, and I'll be blunt about it, is that the FCA is unfit for purpose. It is at its best complacent, risk-averse and naive, and at its worst, it's captured by the Treasury, banks and other big firms. Now, you might think, how does that fit with something like Blackmore Bond? Because, you know, I may have a tinfoil hat theory that actually the FCA exists to protect the banks. But this isn't banks. This is a bunch of wide boys from Manchester. You know, why would they be protected by the FCA? Well, one possible explanation is what I call the three monkey problem. If you create a structure and a culture that generally doesn't act when things go wrong, in terms of big firms, those people will not suddenly wake up and do a fantastic job when suddenly they are asked to hear, speak, and see evil of somebody who is within the financial services industry. The regulator is opaque and unaccountable to consumer interests. It's actually getting worse. I'll come to that in a bit. The revolving door spins fast and frequently. The people who run the FCA tend to all be people who've worked together, and particularly who worked together when the global financial crisis hoved into view and solutions had to be found. So they may tend to see things the same way. And if they were involved in doing things to save the banks in good faith, that may not perhaps pass the kind of, you know, the sniff test these days, perhaps not even the test of criminal activity these days, you know, if they were all involved in doing those things for the right reasons, they all have got a reason why they would not want an effective regulator to be put in place. There is crucially, in the main, no civil liability of the FCA when things go horribly wrong. Think of all other statutory bodies. If they screw up and they cause people to lose money, they can be sued, not this one. It's culturally defective. And if you don't believe me, follow a link in my slides, which I'll provide in due course, to the call for evidence about the FCA run by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services, for which we provide the Secretariat. We've put up maybe 25 videos and written pieces of testimony so far. It's a good cross-section of the probably 6 times that many that we've received. Some of the criticisms actually come from employees past and present of the FCA. They talk about a bias against action, about there being an FCA line on any given issue which you don't dare challenge. If you do, you can be made to sit with other people, not with your team. You can be denied a bonus, denied a promotion, bullied out of the organisation, and in one case, not even mentioned by name once you're removed from the organisation. They also have an obsession with a particular type of diversity, which has been described as people who look different but think the same. They have a very large number of young graduates there, often with law degrees from the same types of universities. They are not perhaps the most frequent employers of people whose jobs have involved investigating, campaigning, or being on consumers' side. So, you know, you don't see many former whistleblowers, for example, being employed there. Maybe they should be running the whistleblowing department. A phrase I used in my testimony, which perhaps is somewhat insulting, but I think is also not entirely untrue, useful idiots led by high-functioning sociopaths. The people on the coalface actually mostly want to do a good job, but the people at the top mostly don't. And the people at the top set the culture and the rules and determine who does what. So the people at the bottom are useful idiots. They're being made, as they've been used as cannon fodder to make it look as though there is effective regulation when really there isn't. Taken together, it's a spectacularly unfit for purpose organisation, and financial fraud will continue to spiral until we deal with the elephant in the room and fix the FCA. So really, this is probably the most important part of this presentation, because it addresses the question of how politicians can fix the FCA. And it is politicians because it's something that requires legislation. Now, by great good fortune, an opportunity has presented itself. I absolutely understand here that some people love Brexit, some people hate it, many people have no view on the subject. But the point about Brexit is that it created an obligation, a requirement on the UK government to reshore responsibility for financial services regulation. In the past, a lot of it sat with the EU. Now, all of it will sit in the UK. And for that to happen, they needed to create a new piece of legislation. So they have drafted the Financial Services and Markets Bill. It had its first reading in July. It will have its second reading on the 7th of September, and then it will go through the 2 houses in committee stage and all the rest of it. It is the biggest and most important piece of financial services legislation since the predecessor of the same name, the Financial Services Markets Act 2000. So this is 23 years later. There's an opportunity to fix some of the problems that were created by that legislation. Once in a generation opportunity. So we believe that it will pass into legislation around May 2023, which means we've got probably 10 months or so to try and influence things, 9 months. There are opportunities, of course, to amend this legislation. One is to challenge any negative changes that are in the law itself. And the other one, which is more important, is to make the case for including new rights and protections. And when we do this, when we talk to parliamentarians, we use the Panorama as the primary piece of evidence that there is a problem here. And the secondary piece of evidence is, if you think Blackmore Bond was bad, here's 50 more that are at least as appalling. So that's the leverage that we needed. And a small thing we'll be asking parliamentarians is to try and get us onto the Parliamentary Bill Committee. And then Andy and I to get themselves onto the Parliamentary Bill Committee if they're interested in this matter. And then they could potentially even invite Andy and myself and others from TTF to give evidence to it. So here is, if you like, our shopping list. These are the absolute minimum steps needed to fix the FCA. Now, I accept there will be some people on this call who say you should abolish the FCA. Absolutely understand that that's a reasonable view based on its performance. But look at what happened in 2012. The FSA was abolished and the FCA was created. It was mostly the same people doing mostly the same things in the same building with a different sign above the door, and we ended up with mostly the same results. I could have told you that would happen. So let's not repeat the mistake and call for abolition again. There'll be people who will say an independent review is needed. Of course, an independent review is needed into what happened with Blackmore Bond, but that will not happen for several years. That's because the FCA's policy is it wants to finish its own enforcement investigations before that happens. I think there will also be prosecutions. So I think that we're probably 3 years away from it being commissioned on a good day, and it'll take 2 years to report, so 5 years away. So we're talking here about the things that are needed now. So the first one is redress for regulatory failure. The FCA should compensate the losses that are caused by regulatory failure. So, of course, Blackmore Bond victims are examples of people who've lost money through regulatory failure. They should be compensated. But the same goes for all of the other cases that came before and all of the ones that will follow after. There are two means by which this could happen. The first is that the FCA's complaint scheme could be obliged by statute to cover paying compensation for regulatory failure, and any awards that are made by the complaints commissioner should become mandatory rather than just advisory. The second one is civil liability. Consumers who believe that they've lost money through regulatory failure should have the right to sue the FCA. Currently, they cannot do this except in very narrow circumstances where there's been bad faith or human rights breach. This will incentivize the regulator to perform its statutory functions to a high standard because it'll be visible what the true costs are of regulatory failure, and they'll also be charged through to the industry because they pay the levy that it would be paid out of. It's really important that there would have to be a Limitation Act waiver as well. So for the first 6 years, the FCA would not be able to point to historic cases and say that's out of time. But I would hope that they would do the right thing and recognise that legacy cases exist and work consensually with the victims to use the complaint scheme as a means of getting redress for those people without the need for litigation. Some people will say this is what's called retroactive legislation, legislation today that creates a liability for things that happened yesterday. Well, firstly, that may not be the truth, actually, because if you look at the Hansard for the parliamentary debates that led to the Financial Services Markets Act coming up into being, it was very much the will of Parliament that people wronged by the FCA should be compensated by it. They just took the view that it should be done via the complaint scheme and not via the need for expensive litigation. However, where they went wrong was they allowed the people who drafted the law to say that the FCA regulators should be able to set their own complaint scheme, so set the rules of the scheme, and that its findings should not be, of the Complaints Commission, should not be binding on the regulator. So actually they did have one route in mind, and they got kind of gamed by the regulator. So the solution now is to put two methods into legislation, the one that was gamed before, and the court type route, just in case the FCA plays dirty in the future. The second reason why it's needed is equity, fairness. You can't have a load of historic victims that are not compensated and a load of new victims that are. How would that be fair? The third reason is because not compensating the legacy victims would be an obstacle to reform, because it would prevent the FCA from fessing up to all of its past failures and saying, we accept those things went wrong, we will fix the problems that led to them. As long as they're trying to deny those past cases so they don't have to pay out, actually they're never going to be able to reform because they can't admit to what the problems are. The second one is transparency and accountability. I've mentioned that the call for evidence has laid bare a defective culture. There's been a recent employment tribunal I've linked to there and an independent review that have all confirmed that the FCA dances to HM Treasury's tune. It is supposed to be independent of the Treasury, but it appears not to be actually when you look at those cases. Consumer interests are not being given sufficient voice at the FCA. Currently, there is one consumer panel. Its members are all chosen by the FCA, and they've got an agreement not to criticise the FCA without first giving a heads up. And there are 3 industry panels. 2 more industry panels will be created under the proposed legislation, and a 6th panel will be created, which will do a cost-benefit analysis, which I suspect will be full of management accountants, management consultants, most of whom work for the banks, who will be trying to make the case that less or more lax legislation regulation is a good thing. In Australia, they had a financial services business that also went, a sector that went quite badly wrong, and they held a Royal Commission. The Royal Commission said, what you need is an oversight body, a body that is staffed by consumer interests that asks the question, is this regulator delivering for the consumer? We agree with that, and we believe that such a thing should be created in the UK. Parliamentarians tried to get this into some legislation last year. They didn't quite succeed. Now the case is even stronger. I hope they'll be successful this time. The third one is a duty of care to be owed by financial services firms to the public, to the consumers of financial services. Now, this is a principle that says if a consumer is harmed because of something that was reasonably foreseeable, that was done by a financial services business, whether or not there's a direct contractual relationship between them, then they should be compensated. It must be enforceable by consumers in a civil court and not just by the FCA via enforcement action. The FCA was tasked to create such a thing in the Financial Services Act 2021. It didn't like it, the industry hated it, so what it did instead was to consult on something that sounds a bit similar but isn't the same, called the consumer duty. And indeed they have brought forward rules about that now. It's better than nothing, but it's nothing like as good as a private right of action would be. And those who talk about over-regulation, consider this. The consumer duty runs to 121 pages. A duty of care encompassed in statute, as it could be in this new bill, would be at most a paragraph, and yet it would actually offer much greater protections and remedies to consumers. It's superior in every regard. So why will this work? Well, the first thing is that payouts for legacy regulatory failure victims are essential. Natural justice is really important, and it's impossible to fix the FCA while it's still battling its critics instead of paying them out. Firms' economic interests, these are authorised firms in the industry, will be aligned with consumers' ones for the first time in calling for an effective FCA. That's because, to put it bluntly, they'll be picking up the bill for all of this compensation. A consumer oversight body would replace this kind of sort of Treasury influence with a statutory consumer one. The consumer panel doesn't really count. Duty of care would recharge negative externalities of misconduct to the firms responsible, and firms would not be able to dodge misconduct costs by hiding them in regulatory failure. So what can individuals do? We are asking individuals, whether they're members of Transparency Task Force or people who separately are involved in the Blackmore Bond Facebook group and accreditors of Blackmore Bond, to write to their MP. As for Transparency Task Force, we're going to be doing 3 versions of the letter. The first one is for Blackmore investors, the second for victims of other regulatory failure cases, and the third is for other campaigners and stakeholders. Obviously, the Blackmore Bond people may want to create their own letter, or they may well want to use ours as a start point, and we are providing it to their creditors committee, and we'll get feedback from them, and hopefully a version can be agreed. If it's agreed, then it will be sent out by the liquidators themselves to the creditors, suggesting that they consider doing this thing and writing to their MPs. The more letters MPs get, the more chance there is of them backing the amendments. So the key message is, please support our amendments to the Financial Services and Markets Bill. We will provide suggested drafts in due course, and let us know if you're on side. So what are the alternatives? Well, for Blackmore investors, you could ask for an independent review. It'll probably be a whitewash and you probably won't see it before 2027. You could complain to the FCA, and then you could complain about the FCA to the Complaints Commissioner. Well, the FCA will say, we're going to hold on to your complaint, do nothing with it until we've finished our enforcement investigations, 2, 3, 4 years probably. And then it'll say, terribly sorry, we got things wrong, it'll be better next time. You'll take it to the Complaints Commissioner, who will say, this is really bad. We may think that actually the FCA should pay compensation, and the FCA will say, no, we don't pay compensation for regulatory failure. So it'll get you nowhere. You could sue the FCA. I think it's unlikely you would succeed. Or you could argue for a bespoke compensatory act of Parliament. This is what happened with London Capital and Finance. The problem with London Capital and Finance is they got it not really because there was anything unique about the case, but because they had such a large number of investors who were able to write to their MPs. MPs were deluged. Of course, Blackmore Bond is a much smaller case, but what we're trying to do is to leverage up the number of investors that they've got by Transparency Task Force and victims of other scams also writing. That's how we're trying to help them. So we're doing everything we can there to make as big an impact as possible. But the parliamentary statements made by the Economic Secretary as Treasurer at the time were about the unique circumstances that led to this compensatory act of Parliament. Those circumstances do not apply to Blackmore Bond, not even close. So unfortunately, it's been ruled out already. So barring a change of government, it's not going to happen before 2024. And even then, you know, do they really want to pick a fight with the FCA and so on and spend this money? I don't know if they do. Barring all of that, I don't think you're going to get anywhere with these options. As for society as a whole, well, the FCA has a transformation project. You could hope that it would succeed. But the problem is actually it's just repeating a pattern. Every incoming FCA chief executive says that they're going to fix the FCA. None of them ever do. Their successor makes the same promise. So I don't believe that Nicky Arati is going to fix the FCA. Another reason for believing that is the person he hired to do the job of fixing it, not some hotshot, you know, turnaround consultant that comes in from industry or from the consultancy sector. No, actually Megan Butler, who's been at the FCA and indeed the FSA since before it obtained its power, since the year 2000 or 2001, and has been named in the London Capital and Finance independent report as one of the people responsible for what went wrong. Incidentally, in the Connaught report, the FCA was lucky enough to get the writer of that report to agree not to name any of the perpetrators. And as a result of that, Megan Butler wasn't named, but if she had have been, she would have, if there were names, hers would have been one of them. Rightly, the Treasury Committee complained about this. Megan Butler left shortly after that judgment, and the programme was then bolted onto the responsibilities of somebody who already has a huge job to do and is struggling to succeed in it. So it's very clear that the project is no longer a priority, if indeed it ever was. And more widely, the FCA continues to delay, deny and deflect with campaigners. See its attitude to freedom of information requests, data subject access requests, etc. Of course, you have to ask this other question. If the FCA is competent, why is it scared of civil liability or of transparency? So here's my conclusion. There are 3 simple amendments that can be proposed to the Financial Services and Markets Bill. We know already there are some parliamentarians that support them. These would create paths to compensation for Blackmore victims and others. Governance, transparency and accountability would be transformed. Industry would owe consumers a duty of care. The honest majority in the industry would gain from improving consumer confidence in financial services and in finally fixing the FCA. If the FCA means what it says, it will welcome change. If it objects, well, at least we'll have flushed out the truth about what we're dealing with. If change doesn't happen, if lives continue to be ruined, it'll be politicians' fault for siding with the FCA instead of its victims, and actually the victims' fault for not writing to the FCA, telling them that we want this, also to the politicians, telling them that we want these legislative changes. So it's on us as well as on the politicians to do the right thing now. Panorama and the forthcoming call for evidence report, which will be published and will be damning, prove that there is a problem. So the message to everybody is please write to your MP. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Over to Andy.
Mark, thank you very much indeed for cramming in such a lot of information in a pretty short period of time. We will be circulating the slides. A great deal of thought has gone into our thinking around what the best next steps are in terms of what could parliamentarians do now, and we'll make sure those slides get circulated to you. In a moment, we're going to hear from Paul Carlier, who had a very important part to play in the programme yesterday, and Paul's going to share some additional thoughts with you that weren't covered in the programme. I'm going to spend a moment just briefly talking about the call for evidence that Paul Carlier just mentioned. So, long story short, what you're looking at right now is the web page for the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. It has approximately 25 or so members of the group, including 4 who are members of the Treasury Select Committee, including Alison Thulis, who you just saw, also Kevin Hollinrake MP, Emma Hardy and Siobhan McDonough. So lots of good MPs there who are very concerned about the position of the financial system in the UK. The APPG has a very clear what they call purpose statement. Every APPG has to have a purpose statement. And as you can see, this purpose statement includes the idea of dealing with regulators who are in some way underperforming. And keeping this long story short, that led to the idea of a call for evidence about the FCA that was launched about a year ago, a bit longer than a year ago. And as Mark touched on, we've had, I think, about 170 or so written submissions for it. Some of those submissions are available online. They're in the public view here on this webpage. I'll put a link to it in a moment in the chat. And there's also roughly, I think, about 15 or so video interviews, some of which are remarkably compelling. You'll get to those when I put a link in the chat. Okay, I'll carry on sort of filling in gaps here and there as we go, but let's go straight to Paul Carlier next. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you.
Hi all. So I don't know how many people were on the call last night, and so I'm conscious I don't want to repeat myself. I'm going to hammer home some of the points that that came up in the programme. I want to deal first of all with the statements that the FCA presented to the programme in their right to reply. I'm going to start with the statement that they made that the FCA claimed that they reported Blackmore Bond to City of London Police in 2017. It's quite clear in the programme, that's exactly what they said. However, in 2021, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to City of London Police regarding reports made to Action Fraud of City of London Police about Blackmore Bond. In the response, and it's quite clear on official City of London Police paper, they confirmed that they received 70 responses or reports about Blackmore Bond between 2016 and 2021. They also confirmed that not one of those reports came from the FCA. This does not make the City of London Police blameless, because the City of London Police also confirmed that they did not disseminate any of those reports that they received to the FCA until Blackmore Bond collapsed. So, you know, you had the FCA sitting on stuff doing nothing, and clearly City of London Police doing similar or the same. The further, with regard to the FCA claims of reports, etc., and many, I'm sure there will be some victims here that made a report to Action Fraud and will have received the response that every person that reported it got. You basically, if you don't understand, you make a report to Action Fraud, which is part of City of London Police, that gets passed to the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, and they then review and come back to you. Now, in every instance, the Blackmore Bond victims that made a report to Action Fraud got a response from the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau saying, and I quote, "It has not been possible to identify a line of inquiry which a law enforcement organisation in the United Kingdom could pursue." This is disturbing in the sense that it's false. Many of you will know that, for example, that Blackmore Bond directors Nunn and McCreesh were and are under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office for their role in the Capita Oak pension scam. a scam that they are alleged to have received £600,000 in commissions for introducing investors to that. And that investigation by the SFO began in May 2017. Secondly, Surge Financial are also under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office for their role in the LCNF fraud. That investigation began in 2019. As you know, Surge received 14 million in commissions for introducing victims to LCNF. Surge were paid 7 million in 2017 by Blackmore Bond for doing exactly the same. So for the NFIB, that is the UK's hub of all fraud investigations and intelligence and information, to say to investors that there were no lines of inquiry is astonishing, is as astonishing as it is dishonest, because we're not talking about evidence to prove guilt here. We're talking about lines of inquiry, something that could be followed. They knew that these 2 lines of inquiry existed, and yet they told investors the opposite. In April last year, after an investor told me they'd got the same response, I made a report to Action Fraud of Blackmore Bond, and rather than wait for their response, I dumped all the information and evidence I had to prove everything on the City of London Police and said, pick the bones out of that, now try and fob me off with the same response. Eventually, I had a call with City of London Police. I got the usual bemoaning lack of resources and how hard it is to investigate these matters. I pointed out that it's even harder when you don't even bother to try in the first instance. And eventually I got an email from City of London Police confirming that, having discussed with other bodies, they had decided that the Insolvency Service would be now launching an investigation. And that, I understand, began in June of last year. But for the record, that was 15 months after Blackmore Bond collapsed. And I understand that liquidators had raised serious concerns with the Insolvency Service within 3 months of Blackmore Bond's collapse, but nothing had happened. As you'll recall, in the programme, it intimated that the Insolvency Service were taking no further action. That's, for me, is inconceivable. I will be following it up, and I will be challenging City of London Police now to say, right, now that you've exhausted the Insolvency Service, what are you going to do about it? Because, you know, in terms of the fraud and the criminality here. So I will keep you abreast of that as we proceed. One of the key points of the whole programme, and I'm extremely grateful for producers for making sure that they really hammered this home, was that the FCA's position in April 2020 was that everything about Blackmore Bond was beyond the FCA's perimeter, authority and powers. It's as dishonest today as it was in April 2020 when they made the representations, right? The Financial Services and Markets Act and FCA COBS both prohibit the marketing and sale of unregulated investment products to non-sophisticated investors. That's it. Now, the whole purpose of that prohibition is to stop sharks and scammers from carrying on this kind of business. And it forces people to become authorized in order to be able to do that. Now, so obviously, if the law is designed to outlaw the outlaws doing it, then when you find the outlaws are doing it, that regulation and law applies more so to those non-regulated businesses doing it than even the regulated businesses that are found doing it. So, and the FCA had the powers to act, and this is really important as well. In 2016, the FCA changed rules whereby they made it, they put a burden on firms they had to undertake measures, steps and due diligence to determine that these people investing or seeking to invest were indeed non-sophisticated people. And they actually prohibited the act of box ticking. In other words, you can no longer rely on somebody just ticking a box to say they're sophisticated. You have to carry out searches, checks, due diligence to make sure this person is non-sophisticated or is sophisticated to do this investment. Whereas in the programme, the FCA said, investors ticked a box to say they understood it. Nonsense. The FCA is referring and relying upon a box ticking that they actually themselves prohibited and outlawed in 2016. It's just absolute nonsense. The FCA had the powers to go into Blackmore Bond in 2017 in response to my allegations that they were targeting non-sophisticated customers and manipulating the sophistication, and force Blackmore Bond to hand over all the evidence of due diligence and steps they'd taken to determine that these clients were sophisticated. They had those powers and they failed to do it. And it wasn't just me that reported that. In March 2018, a regulated IFA wrote to Mark Stewart and pointed out the whole checkered history of Macreish and Nunn. He highlighted that they were marketing this toxic stuff to non-sophisticated investors, and he even listed the specific parts of COBS and the FISMA that this breached, and it listed the powers the FCA had as a result to go in and put a stop to it, and they did nothing. So, and on the last aspect of this point is that I wrote a freedom of information request to the FCA earlier this year and asked, if you receive reports or intelligence about conduct or actions that are beyond your perimeter authority and powers, what is the FCA's established protocol? Mark Stewart himself wrote back, and he wrote that whenever this happens and they receive such reports, they will direct the intelligence and reports to the relevant body or agency, and they will signpost the person making the report to the same relevant body or agency. In March 2017, August 2018, and in August 2019, when the 3 times when I made the initial report and then escalated and chased it, not once did the FCA turn around to me and signpost me to another agency. All I got in the initial report is, we are escalating it to the relevant department. Great. In 2018, Mark Stewart himself wrote back to say they were making inquiries. And in 2019, a year on, Mark Stewart confirmed that this was still part of their ongoing work. Let me ask you this. Who spends a year investigating something that is beyond their perimeter authority and powers? Nobody. And the reason that they were doing it is because they knew full well it was within their perimeter authority and powers. And for me, it's quite clear what happened. I think Bailey and Stewart in 2018, when I made them aware of the reports I made in March 17, clearly realised they'd dropped the ball, they'd missed an opportunity, and instead of picking the ball up, chose to bury the ball and bury investors along with it. And that brings me on to the letter that the internal FCA document that I obtained, and I'm sure they never intended me to see it. And it was dated October 2020. And in it, it says that we missed, this was produced by the person that had spent a year investigating my complaint that the FCA had failed to act on my intelligence and reports. So having spent that year investigating, his conclusion was, in respect to my reports of March 2017, I considered that we missed an opportunity to act on that intelligence. And in respect to my reports and escalations to Andrew Bailey and Mark Stewart in 2018, he likewise said, I consider that we missed an opportunity to act on that intelligence most recently in 2018. So they accepted that they missed an opportunity. That's an admission that had they acted in March 2017, then there would have been a very different outcome. So they're accepting liability. However, in the document, and as you saw in the program, these were crossed out. Now, and a year on, I would finally get the actual response, and it was a very different story. And it was still guff and nonsense, but it was a different type of guff and nonsense. And the FCA in the program said that to justify those crossing out of those conclusions was that after that, new information or evidence came to light. Really? How? That is inconceivable, right? This guy who investigated it, spent a year investigating it, he had access to every piece of incoming intelligence and reports that the FCA had on this, dating back to 2017, if not before. Having done that, investigated absolutely everything, those were his conclusions. Somebody needs to tell me what possible information or evidence could have come to light after he wrote those conclusions in October 2020 that could have changed his conclusion that they didn't miss an opportunity to act on that intelligence. What came to light? What did they find? There was nothing that could have changed that outcome. There was no evidence that was received after October 2020 could have changed that. The bottom line is he produced those findings. It wasn't consistent with the narrative that the FCA wanted to present. And the moment he presented them, he was hauled off the case. Those findings were changed and crossed out, and somebody else delivered a completely different narrative a year later, one that was more consistent with what the FCA wanted and one that sought to deny liability. But in my opinion, that letter, I consider we missed an opportunity to act on intelligence, is an admission of liability and failure by the FCA, and that's what we should be holding them to. So let me just go on to one more point. And furthermore, this is on the issue of it was beyond our perimeter and control. You may well be aware that there was an airport car park scam that was basically the FCA uncovered, the FCA intervened on, and it was an unregulated investment scheme being run by non-regulated people and non-regulated companies. Yet the FCA intervened and acted because they were doing exactly what I was alleging. They were selling this stuff, this unregulated investment product, to non-sophisticated customers. So the FCA acted. Similarly, in 2018, the FCA secured 5 fraud convictions for people running an unregulated investment scam. And that, again, the 5 people they prosecuted and the various companies they were associated with, none of them were regulated or authorised by the FCA, but didn't stop the FCA from acting. And again, they were able to act on the same basis they were peddling this stuff to non-sophisticated investors. The bottom line here is the FCA had the powers, but in this case, they failed to act initially. And then in 2018, when they realised they dropped the ball, they chose not to act, and they chose to cherry pick how to apply their perimeter authority and powers. So that's all for me.
Paul, Carlier, thank you very much indeed. We're going to thank everybody involved with the programme in one big go to save some time, because we've got a lot to get through. Thank you ever so much, Paul, and thank you, Mark, for your session before, both of which have been excellent. As I mentioned in the chat, Peter Grant MP is with us. Peter has been a remarkably helpful and supportive parliamentarian in relation to the things that the Transparency Task Force is trying to shine a big bright light on. And he spoke at the event we had about Blackmore Bond a couple of months ago in London. Mr. Peter Grant, could you please share with us the thoughts you'd like to about the Blackmore Bond scandal? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Apologies for my late arrival into the meeting. Obviously, I haven't heard everything that's gone before. I'll give you some of my own thoughts on the matter. I think if I had to sum up my thoughts in a single sentence, if what Blackmore Bond did wasn't a serious criminal offence, then it should have been. And if the law doesn't say there was serious criminal activity there just now, which is quite possibly it won't, then we have to change the law very quickly so that the next sort of tranche of Blackmore Bond type scandals can be cut off at source. I find it extremely frustrating, as I know a lot of you do, and certainly a lot of the investors who have lost money are appalled at the fact that the Financial Conduct Authority are very good at closing the stable door after not only is the stable gone, but the horse gone, but the stable's been burnt down. They need the additional powers, they need the additional resources, and I think they need a statutory responsibility to make sure that they are at least keeping level with the game and ideally keeping ahead of the game. They should be scanning the way that technology is developing, the way that markets are developing, to know where the likely dangers are going to come from before the bad guys get onto it. At the moment, it seems as if the bad guys come up with a slightly different version of an old scam so that it just falls outside the perimeter of the regulation. They run it for about 5 years. The authorities start to catch up with it, and about 5 years after that, they get shut down. And because what they were doing was outside or claimed to be outside the scope of the regulations, they've got quite a good chance of getting away with it. I've previously pointed out to the Financial Conduct Authority that if I was of a mind and of a capability to carry it out, if I break into a wealthy person's house and steal £1 million worth of money or jewellery, the police are not going to drop that case because they're too busy. They're not going to drop it because it's too wee to worry about. If somebody works £1 million scam involving people's investments or savings or pensions, there's a good chance that it will never get proper attention from the FCA or the other regulators, because the FCA are also looking at the multi-trillion-pound scandals, you know, your Barings, your BCCI type things. I think that's far too wide a scope, far too wide a range of scales for them to do either properly. They still, despite the protestations, I don't think they really understand the human cost of 2,000 people seeing their futures disappear with Blackmore Bond. What was it, 11,000 with LCF? Tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people every year facing the same kind of misery. That is a damage to society. It's a damage to the well-being of all of us that is more important, or as important, as the amount of money that each person loses. I generally don't think a lot of people at FCA realise that losing £50,000 out of your pension fund can be a life-destroying experience. If I had to, I could replace £50,000. If people give me another few years as an MP, I could probably do it quite comfortably. A lot of people, that's all the money they have to keep the wolf from the door. So taking that by either illegal methods or by dodgy but just about legal methods is about as despicable as it gets. Looking at what allowed Blackmore Bond to happen, I can actually see a lot of similarities between say Fan's funeral plans collapse, which on the face of it looks completely different. And what I'm looking at now, possibly through amendments to the Financial Services and Markets Bill, although I don't know if we'll be able to squeeze it in there, I think we need to completely redefine what we decide to regulate in terms of financial markets and services, as well as looking at the product that somebody's selling, and as well as possibly looking at the nature of the person who's selling it. I think we need to start looking at regulating businesses based on where their main source of investment capital is coming from. If they get most of the capital that's put at risk from the issue of shares, that's regulated. Maybe not well enough, but it's regulated. If they get it from properly established and regulated banks or investment banks, they've got regulation behind them to protect them. If they're taking it from innocent members of the public, at the moment, unless they can be shown to be selling a product that is explicitly regulated by the FCA, there's a huge loophole that the dodgy characters will always exploit. I'd like to see a change that says that unless the capital that the company puts at risk is coming from certain permitted sources, such as shareholder investment, loans from directors and so on, then it will be assumed that that business falls under stricter financial regulation. And the kind of additional requirements that go into it, it may be that in some cases the FCA would just be able to stop in and say, no, you have to stop doing that. But some kind of vague attempt at transparency for these companies would make a big difference. I'm convinced that if Companies House regularly looked at new company registrations and had people there whose job it was to look at them and say, hang on a minute, what's going on here? They would have asked questions about the company structure at Blackmore Group, probably even before Paul started warning them about their sales tactics. When they then looked, and by my reckoning, none of McCreesh were directors of at least 35 different companies in the UK. We don't know what else they've got going on in Gibraltar and the rest of it. Those companies ran up a total of at least 59 final warnings for compulsory strike-off because they failed to comply with statutory transparency requirements. Now, the transparency requirements for a private limited company of the size of most of the Blackmore companies are non-existent anyway. They didn't even comply with them 59 times. There was no action. Even some of the companies that had 4 or 5 of those wind-up notices issued against them, they submitted the paper they had to submit. The slate was wiped clean, and then the following year they failed to submit it again. It's the equivalent of saying to somebody, you've got 59 speeding tickets, but because you collected them on 45 different cars, we're not going to add them up together and take away your license. There needs to be some kind of cumulative reckoning against individual directors. If they are directors of a number of companies, all of whom are quite flagrantly ignoring the transparency requirements. If a company is acting in a way, if they're investing or if they're speculating with money that has come from ordinary members of the public through mini bonds, through funeral plans, through Christmas hamper plans, which is another one that we saw a number of years ago, I think that the transparency requirements have got to be much more detailed than they would usually be for a company of that size, so that they have to get their accounts audited, maybe not every year, but at least every few years. They have to produce a profit and loss account rather than just a balance sheet. They have to outline related party transactions. They have to declare payments to shareholders and payments to directors, so that somebody looking at the accounts that are being submitted, and I think there's a need for some kind of statutory watchdog to do that, somebody that had looked at proper disclosure of the way the money was going through the Blackmore, a spider's web of companies, would have known that something wasn't right, certainly before the Financial Conduct Authority acted, and possibly before Paul even overheard the conversations that he overheard, because it's quite clear when you look through even the limited information that they've had to disclose to Companies House, there were warning signs about that group of companies long before the Financial Conduct Authority stepped in. The second thing that we need to do, and I can understand the government's concerns about it, but there needs to be a much more widely framed right to compensation than we have just now. It's far too easy for people to set up investment schemes that fall out with the regulatory regime of the Financial Conduct Authority. That usually means they're not picked up by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. So they get you two ways. You're taking part in a scheme that you think is properly regulated that isn't, and then when it all goes wrong, you don't even get your 75,000 maximum compensation from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. There needs to be a much more sort of general provision of no blame, no admission liability compensation. Effectively, that should mean that the taxpayer takes a hit initially, and if the regulator eventually catches up with the company and is able to recover assets from the directors, for example, it's the public purse that is waiting to get repaid. What's happening just now is that the investors have to wait for maybe 10, 15, 20 years before they get their money back, and that's only if there's successful legal action against the directors. It's too easy just now for dodgy directors to get away with it for so long that they could well be dead by the time the law catches up with them, if it ever does. I don't think there's anything like enough of a deterrent on people to stop them from trying to set up these kinds of scams. And the final thing I think we need to look at, and it's something my colleague Alison Thulis has been screaming about for years, we need to change the way that companies in the United Kingdom can be set up. There are certain kinds of companies whose only purpose, whose only reason for existing is to hide everything from the regulator, so that the ultimate owner of a company can be something that lives in a postbox somewhere in the British Virgin Isles, is absolutely exempt from any kind of disclosure at all. Those companies can literally do what they like, and they're beyond the reach of UK law. If they're taking money from UK investors, if they're operating within the territories of the UK, then they should be fully subject to the laws of the United Kingdom. The people that regulate and enforce those laws need to be given additional powers. They need to be given the resources to enforce them. I don't think either the Companies Register or the FCA have got the resources that they need. But once they're given those resources, they need to be put on a statutory footing. And in the same way as there needs to be direct personal accountability for company directors that break the rules, there needs to be direct personal accountability for chief officers at regulators such as the FCA who fall asleep at the wheel. I think there are big questions to be asked as to why the then Chief Executive Officer of the FCA hasn't been held to account personally in any way whatsoever for the failings of the organisation that he was in charge of. He was well rewarded for the responsibility he claimed to be taking for the actions or inactions of his organisation. He should now be held to account for the fact that at the same time as he was responsible for it, the organisation quite clearly failed in the duty it set up to provide.
Peter, thank you so much. I made a note in the chat before you started speaking that you do know a great deal about Blackmore Bond. I know that you spent a lot of time about Blackmore Bond with your constituents and the people that you represent, and you're doing an amazing job with that. Thank you very much for being here, Peter, and for sharing your thoughts. Folks, before we move on to the Q&A part of the meeting, could we please sort of collectively thank Peter Grant and Mark Bishop and Paul Carlier and all the people involved with the programme, such as Mahendra Bajaj and Linda Lloyd and Paul and Jane Stevens and John Robbins and everybody else. It really was a massive team effort, including the people at Nine Lives Media, etc., etc. We really do think that the Panorama programme is going to be of massive strategic significance. Okay, we'll move on to Q&A now. So the way we're going to try to manage this is to ask those who want to make a point, ask a question, provide a comment, to raise your hand, either literally like this, of course, or do it digitally if you know how to. So I'm going to click to gallery view so I can see you all. Please raise your hand if you'd like to make a point. In the interest of time, make your point as succinctly as you possibly can. And if we respond, we'll also try to be very succinct. We've got a mic. I can't quite see which mic it is, but we've got a mic with his hand up. Mike, please. Thank you, Mike. Please share your thoughts. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So I've been in financial services for 42 years, 20 of those with the Clydesdale Bank, 22 years of mortgages, and obviously I've run a claims company about poor financial advice since 2011. And the amount of stuff that I've reported to the FCA about, and I mean, we're talking huge stuff about the Royal Bank here, Lloyds. Okay, I managed to get the Clydesdale fine, 20.7 million way back in 2015. But the number of times I write to them and they do absolutely nothing. So, for example, we've got an unregulated pension advisor locally in Dundee, being given unregulated pension advice since May 2009. I have given the FCA stacks of evidence, you know, showing that he's taking cash from people for things he couldn't do. Giving unregulated pension advice is 2 years in jail. I've tried to report it to, you know, we had the police in here, tried to get the FCA involved, and now I'm 3 years down the line and they've done absolutely nothing. Now, I've even got an email from them that says, please, can you stop sending me more evidence?
You're joking?
No, I've got it. It's incredible, right? Now, I mean, it's great that we've got Peter here, because Peter, I deal a lot with Stuart Hosey, and honestly, it's like knocking my head off a brick wall, because I've had to get Stuart involved very, very slow. I've written, I don't know how many times to Alison Thulis, written recorded delivery. You know, Alison couldn't even be bothered picking up my mail. But look, I've got so much to tell you. Fife is in Scotland is absolutely jumping with pension fraud. Indeed, is the whole of Scotland. In terms of people being moved from final salary schemes, we're not just talking about fraud schemes like what you've got just now. It is horrendous. There's many financial advisors have sold their books for millions by doing something they shouldn't have done in the first place. It is quite frankly disgusting. I keep reporting to the FCA as they do nothing. There's a big fraud just now. Portal Financial LLP. You couldn't write this. This company actually phoenixed as far back as 2016. The FCA have done nothing about it. They've got nearly 100 decisions against them. They're not paying claims. They're not answering their phones. They're not. They surrendered their permissions way back in July last year. They're in danger of being struck off because the last set of annual accounts should have been submitted 31st December last year. The FCA are doing nothing about it. And unfortunately, because of when these people lost their money, the danger is that these people are going to be time barred for a claim then through the FSCS. You have to wonder whether the slowness of the FCA has all got to do with the pot that's going to have to be paid out by the FSCS. I mean, call me suspicious.
Thank you, Mike. You've made your points very, very well. Mike, two questions. Number one, what is your surname?
Mike Begg, B-E-G-G.
Thank you very much, Mike. Okay, please don't hesitate to contact me with the evidence you sent the FCA, because it's quite appalling that they don't want to see the evidence that's designed to try to mitigate consumer harm, and it's ridiculous. Thanks very much, Mike. We'll go from Mike to Modwena Rees-Mogg. Modwena, your thoughts, please.
So I've been involved in financial services, and in particular, I was very involved in the emergence of the mini bond market, which was then unregulated and became regulated. And I was sort of sitting alongside that market, seeing what happened. First thing is, the people who set the regulation for mini bonds were the mini bond industry and peer-to-peer industry, who weren't regulated and sort of chose to be regulated and wrote their own rules. So you have to be really careful who sets the new rules, because depending on the people setting them, will have outcomes in their own best interests. So that's the first thing: is it properly independent, wise people who can do change? The other thing I'd say is the FCA and FSA, and I've had an SFA, God knows, in 30 years. There's always calls to, it's so rubbish, break it up and start it again. I honestly believe this. The fundamental problem is there are always crooks where there's easy cash to be had. We know that. So what you need to try and do is stop them getting to people, make it difficult for them to actually find people. So you need to do things about allowing it to be easy, as you say, for corrupt IFAs to do dodgy things, but that's quite a specific thing that you could change quite quickly and have a big impact. You'll have seen my stuff on chat, so I won't repeat any of that. The other issue, which is a really important one, which I think people always ignore, is that why do people invest? They invest to make money and they want to make great returns. And most people don't understand what a 15% return means in terms of risk compared with leaving your money in the bank at getting 0.1%. And this is the crucial issue we need to change across the whole country. It's a relatively simple thing to do, and it would change people's behaviour if they understood that a promise of a 10 or 15% return, even with inflation at 10% today, is still an extraordinary high risk compared with if it's absolutely safe with in the Bank of England. And if you could get that message across to people to say, I know some pretty clever, I work in the angel world, I know some pretty clever, pretty rich people who've been done over because they're basically greedy and they're uneducated. I don't want to use the word fool, that's insulting. So again, I do really, and I will support, Andy, your initiative as much as I possibly can, and I will share and support anything to help this problem. But no amount of regulation oversight will stop this unless we get it out and make it really clear to people what high returns mean.
Thank you, Modena, for sharing your thoughts very clearly indeed. We want to manage time as best as we can, so let's, folks, be as succinct as possible. Pauline Creasy, who's a very active member of the TTF community. Pauline, please briefly introduce yourself and share your thoughts. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Andy, for letting me speak. I just wanted to say a couple of things, actually. I was involved in a big fraud, the Premier FX scandal. We did manage to get our money back, but it was only because really my group went and got a lot of the evidence and gave it to the FCA. And my MP was also very active in making them do something with it. But as I know from many of you that it's very difficult to get that kind of attention or get a good result. Most people don't ever get their money back. In the context, in terms of how we improve our lot, in terms of getting our money back and get better regulation and a better fraud agency investigating fraud, because that's not happening. A senior Treasury official told me early on when I was trying to get attention for our, fraud scandal, which was 12.3 million. So it was a lot of money to us. I lost $500,000, so I was very committed to do something about it. But 12.4 million is not very much in the scheme of things, and we knew that. So how do you get anybody's attention on that when the FCA will say, we've got to concentrate on the large firms? A senior Treasury official told me, no one in the UK authorities is interested in fraud. Pauline, don't waste your time. The only time we get involved in fraud cases is if it's very big, and it's usually an international collaboration, and we've got international obligations to fulfill. Most of the time, he said, it will not get picked up. Also, Andrew Bailey told me, he said, the FCA is the wrong place to investigate fraud. He said, we do not have those skills. We are not a fraud agency. And he has actually raised this a few times when he was the CEO of the FCA with the National Economic Crime Centre, who I think should be taking this up. And I don't know whether anybody has got a better rapport with them than I do, but I'm not quite too sure. They just seem to be another talking shop. And I'm sorry if somebody knows better than me and I could actually point out to what they're doing, but they strike me as somebody who should be taking this up. So going back to what I was saying about the Financial Services Markets Act, the new one that's being negotiated, the bill that's going through, I think it's important that we get a separate regulator for small and medium firms and the non-bank payment firms. I got defrauded by a non-bank payment firms. The regulation is extremely light on these non-bank payment firms and small and medium firms because the FCA is concentrating on the large firms. Most of the fraud that affects people like us are committed by non-bank payment firms or by small and medium firms. Therefore, they need a dedicated regulator, and it would be an opportunity to create a new regulator with people who have got proper fraud skills, some good detectives who have been working in this area, who are street smart, and it would get them away from the type of perhaps people that are prevalent on the accountancy and lawyer side in the FCA. We need street smart people who understand how criminals think, how fraudsters think. I mean, those guys that we saw on the TV last night, the Manchester Wide Boys, that's what they are, Manchester Wide Boys. And we recognize what they're doing. It's very apparent what they're doing. They're not even that smart. The reason why they're getting away with it is because nobody is making any attempt to stop them. And it's easy money for them. It's such easy pickings if you're registered in Britain, go and rob people. So that's my point, is we need a separate regulator for small and medium firms and the non-bank payment firms, extremely vital. I think we've got to realise the FCA are not going to do this type of job, and they've got lots of get-outs as to why they shouldn't. I absolutely appreciate everything that Paul and everyone has said about them cherry-picking about certain cases and not picking up others. But I think that's their argument, that they have to cherry-pick because they can't do everything. They will concentrate on the big cases when they've got international obligations to do so. Final point, somebody said something about, why aren't Interpol involved in some of these cases, given that they cross borders? We looked at that very closely. And in fact, we managed to get a good contact at Interpol who said, because our case spread over several European countries, the firm was registered in Britain, but they had passported their non-bank payment services business to other countries, including America, which in fact was illegal. They hadn't been permission to operate in America, but they were. But they were very active in Portugal and Spain. and Interpol were very interested. But the trouble there is the consumer, the victims, can't go directly to Interpol. And you, in fact, have to get your own agency, whether it's the police, like the city police, or a regional police force, or the FCA, to actually register the case for Interpol help. And this is a major problem, because if the police force is not interested or is saying they don't have the resources to go and investigate your case, or the FCA choose not to investigate your case, you can't then get Interpol involved. We tried to get the Portuguese to do it, but I had the distinct impression, even though the Portuguese police did an absolute excellent job with our case, and they're still pushing it through their criminal courts in order to try and get convictions of the directors, which has not happened in Britain. But they didn't seem to want to go up against the FCA in terms of registering it as a case of interest for Interpol to get involved in. So I just thought I would flag that up, because we have some major problems. People expect the FCA to do things, but quite often the FCA is a block on anyone else doing anything. And that is something which has to be resolved in this new financial service markets bill.
Thank you, Paul. You make a great point. Well, from what we've seen, the memorandum of understanding between the FCA and other bits of the ecosystem do exactly as you say. They effectively give the FCA whole position to take action, but then when the FCA don't take action, nobody's taken action. Thanks very much, Pauline, and congratulations again on the success you had with Premier FX. Superb campaigning. We've got a Tim with his hand up. Is that Tim Thomas? Tim, is that you? With your hand up? It is.
Yeah,
hi, Tim.
A bit of context. I'm a financial services, financial crime lawyer, and I have been for almost 20 years. I also worked in enforcement in the FCA for 4 years. Both as an investigative lawyer and also as a member of the criminal prosecutions team. Very interested in the documentary last night. Just for context as well, I worked on the final Connaught investigation. I had a hand in refusing someone authorization on Bassett and Gold, which we then flagged up.
Yeah.
Amongst other things, I could go on to other bits of business, but I won't. I think the broad point I want to make to those listening is, having worked with colleagues in FCA, and I'm not an apologist for the FCA because I've been very, very critical of it, both when I was in the organisation and afterwards, is that there are very capable investigators, both lawyers and accountants within enforcement. But enforcement as a capacity only has about 200 people in it. And if you look at the amount of money that is available to investigate matters in the actual enforcement budget, it is a pittance if you compare it to the type of budget that the DOJ has in America. And so whilst I'm sure the FCA could manage its resources better, what I would say is when the resources put and people have a mind to it, it does work. I worked on a single case, which is actually in the public domain now, called Faithful, which was a conviction for money laundering, which happened last year, where there was one investigator on that case, and I advised on the criminal part of it. And he was an ex-SFO guy, and he got that done all on his own, and it was a collaboration with City of London Police. So I think the problem that a number of people have raised already is that senior management, senior figures do not see the FCA as an enforcement agency. They see it as a regulator. That is the problem. If you could cut that aspect out, you'd actually effectively have to sack probably all the directors and possibly some senior management figures or heads of department, or remove them from post and actually put in people with proper enforcement experience who've actually worked in, not necessarily, I mean, I'd argue bring them in from private practice, who've actually worked in financial crime and financial regulation and change the culture. But the FCA internally has to decide to be something which it thinks it's not, and that's actually a proper enforcer. And I think until that happens, it doesn't matter. Whilst I agree that the Financial Services and Markets Act, this bill, if it comes in and the way that people on this forum want it to be, then that will be a huge improvement. But it actually has to have a willing partner in the FCA to actually enforce it. All I'd say is, again, people I've worked with in enforcement, both investigators and lawyers, do actually, in my experience of 4 years, they did actually care very deeply about victims in these cases. But they were often frustrated by senior management decisions to either delay investigations or shut them down too soon. And it becomes a capacity problem. You can't, like I said, if you have one investigator who's like a rat up a drain pipe, and sadly he's gone off to Merrill Lynch because they wouldn't pay, were paying him a pittance. If you have that person doing that job, investigating effectively one case, even on their own, he got it done within 2 years. But if you have 7 people on a team and they're all handling 10 cases at once, it doesn't work, because all that's happened is you're pushing paper around a desk in order to hit certain targets, but you're not reaching an outcome. So that's my 2 pence.
Thank you for your 2 pence. It's caused a problem for you though, Tim, because I'm now going to ask my colleague Chelsea to fix up a Zoom with you and I, because there's a couple of ideas we're going to talk through off the back of what you just set out. So thank you very much. In all seriousness, there's a couple of ideas we'll bounce off you. Cheers, Tim. That was great.
Yeah.
Mr. Paul Carlier, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to expand on a couple of things there as well. I mean, I've got evidence to show, you know, in my own personal cases, almost a civil war going on within the FCA. I've got internal emails where the FCA whistleblower team were being told to lie to me by group counsel, and you can't tell him that, and you know, instead you need to tell him this, and the stuff they were telling them to tell me was false. And you know, so I believe that there are really good, qualified and well-intentioned people at the FCA and within the FCA, and the whistleblower team is probably the team that falls most foul of this, in the sense that they have no teeth, you know, or influence, and are subject to what is imposed on them by others. And I mean, some of these internal emails, you know, are quite disturbing. I mean, and the group counsel coming back and threatening and accusing the whistleblower team of ignoring their instructions, and that they must have tipped me off about this process that was available to me. And I mean, it's quite an enlightening experience, upsetting, but also encouraging that there were good people there. My other point on this is that, you know, and Rathi himself, before the Treasury Select Committee, said, you need to understand how expensive it is to go and do retrospective investigations. Well, yeah, we know that. It's not easy, and it's not, but if you act on whistleblower intelligence in the first place, you get real-time intelligence, and you engage with those people. They can tell you where all the other bits and pieces of the puzzle might be, or where else to look. But the other thing as well is, if you punish somebody and really get the stick out and properly punish someone to the full extent of the law, it acts as a deterrent. It reduces the risk of these things happening again, and therefore decreases the possibility that you're going to need to do these huge retrospective investigations. I mean, libel, how long had libel been going on? You know, under everyone's noses. FX, you know, market manipulation and everything else, it's been going on for 5 years under everyone's noses. If you'd acted it before, you wouldn't have had to have then wasted all these resources, or the prospect of wasting all these resources on a lengthy post-event investigation. A proper enforcement results in not just good outcomes, but good deterrent as well. So, but likewise, Tim, I'd be really interested to speak with you.
Chelsea, can you add Mark Bishop and Paul to the conversation we're going to have with Tim Thomas? Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Paul, forgive me, I may not pronounce your name correctly, Paul. Paul Clairol, can you pronounce it for me correctly, then make your point? Thank you. You're on mute though, Paul.
You pronounce it better than I could pronounce your name, Andy. Excellent programme last night, well done, and good chat here as well. I just really want to make the case, and I know it's not you know, the aim of your task force. I get that, but I just want to make the case that we need to nail this education point. We've been swapping some ideas in the chat, but just to give you a sense of this, I was talking to Adam Owen, who you may know. He was the president of the Personal Finance Society last year, and he reached out to me. We had a conversation a couple of years ago, and he said, you know what, Paul, I agree with you. He said, we are never going to protect the consumer from wrongdoing until we educate the consumer, right? So this catching up after the event, this trying to persuade the FCA to behave better, to get other people to behave better, it's all very good, you know, getting redress, getting compensation, people getting 70% of their losses back. It's all well and good, isn't it? But it's really not fixing the problem. And what will fix the problem is if 99% of the adult population knows how to ask 5 questions, knows how to ask a question about charges. That will frighten most scammers off. Tell me exactly what the front and ongoing charge is of this thing. Yeah. Tell me what the liquidity of the investments is if I need to get my money out. I won't go into it now. I've written the program for other providers, but there are only 5 or 6 things you need to teach people about rating an investment product that will protect them. And yet no one's doing it. I mean, we've had some chat in the thing here, about our friends at the, what's it's called? The Shareholders Association. And they've got some lovely theoretical stuff on there, but it's not in plain English. It's not what 90% of the public will understand. So we've got to get these messages across clear and simple. And that's where the whole show is failing. We're overcomplicating this. So it's just a plea for education, clear and simple.
Thank you. You make your point really well, Paul. What happens though if the person you're asking the question just lies to you?
Yeah. Okay. No, I get that, but I'm talking about nailing most of the problem, right? There will always be idiots. There will who get taken to the cleaners. There will always be gullible people who get taken to the cleaners. There will always be scammers who just lie, yes, of course. But the point is, most of these people are frightened off. Whenever I get a call, I don't know what you do, whenever I get a call, I just start asking a few simple questions to the caller and the phone goes dead, doesn't it? The phone goes dead because I say, can you just explain to me? Brrr, the phone's dead. You've got rid of them.
Yeah,
right?
I guess a couple of points I'd like to make. One is you're able to think those things through because you know this subject matter. The very nature of a lot of these victims are that they are vulnerable people who don't know. So if you're in the business of scamming, like any company, you define your optimum marketplace, you target market those people who are most likely to fall prey to your horrific acts that you want to carry out. Paul Carlier heard the calls to vulnerable elderly people who didn't know what they didn't know, and they were conned into it. I really feel uncomfortable when the victim starts becoming part of the problem. The victim is a victim, end of, from my point of view. It's down to society to create a framework that is there to protect them. And I agree with you, Paul. Some of that is about financial education. But if we have a regulator whose job is to provide an appropriate degree of consumer protection, who is consistently failing to do that, then we must ask the question, why is there something horrifically wrong with the FCA? And that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I didn't want to detract from it. I absolutely agree. Your mission is absolutely right. I'm just saying, in the meantime, let's get the education right.
I understand. Thank you. We're going to go to Mark Bishop, then if she's up for it, and only if she's up for it, for Lisa King, then to Sam South. So Mark, then Lisa, then Sam South. Mark, thank you.
Thank you. So I've just put a link in the chat to something that Andy and I were talking about the other day, which is an episode of the podcast Political Thinking with Nick Robinson, in which he interviews Martin Lewis. And we both found that really interesting because he's probably the most significant consumer campaigner in the United Kingdom today. So we thought we could maybe learn something from him. And one of the things that he said really clearly was about those letters that made him famous, asking people to write to their bank to challenge overdraft charges or to deal with PPI, mis-selling. And he said that he subsequently spoke with a woman who headed up the department in a major bank that received these letters. And she told him that 5% of the people who sent in those letters were so unsophisticated that it hadn't occurred to them they needed to put their own name and address on there in order to get a reply. Now, unfortunately, the population of the country is a bell curve. And we could, for example, introduce mandatory financial education in schools tomorrow. And within 100 years, pretty much the entire population would have been through that product at some point in their lifetime. Could be decades ago. Or we could, maybe introduce retrospective education of that sort for every adult. Would you be able to make people go? I don't know. Would they understand it? Heaven only knows. Or we could deal with it the other way, which we could create a duty of care applicable to all authorised firms that requires them to establish that the person that they're dealing with understands the product. So there you're transferring some part of the obligation to another party, which is the firm. I think that's not inappropriate because they're the ones that make the economic return from such a sale if it goes well. So I do absolutely agree, financial education would be a good thing, but financially educating everybody to the point at which they understand things the way we do is not an achievable aim, and certainly not within a reasonable timescale. And until that aim is achieved, I think we have got to create some obligation on financial services firms to act appropriately, and perhaps more important, personal consequences that are adverse for the individuals when they fail to achieve this.
Well, thank you, Mark, very much. One of the simplest things we could do is try to get the system to use the powers and rules it's already got effectively. For example, and Mark Bishop will tell you the numbers but much better than I can, the senior manager certification regime. So Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, gave a speech at one of the Wreath lectures at Christmas. He basically said, the single most important conclusion from the financial collapse in 2007-8, the global financial crisis, was that there was a lack of individual accountability and responsibility. Therefore, the most important regulatory response is the senior managers certification regime. Brilliant idea, absolutely brilliant idea. Properly, prosecute the people who've done bad things. How many times has it ever been used? Hardly ever. And this is just a really good example of how it's a failure to do what the system is designed to do. I personally think people with the wrong kind of mindset are running the FCA. Because if the people with the right kind of mindset were running the FCA, they would make enforcement a much more important part of their job, and they would hold the baddies out to account, and they lock up some on the way. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to go to Lisa King. If Lisa is happy to speak. Lisa, you've raised your hand. I can see that you're feeling the way that you're feeling. I know you well enough to know why you are feeling that way, but maybe others don't. If you want to introduce yourself, Lisa, and explain why this is impacting you the way it is, please do so, Lisa, but only say what you want to say. And if you don't want to say anything, you don't have to. Oh, Lisa.
I watched the programme yesterday, and whilst I'm not, my late husband Peter and I were not victims of any savings scams, we are victims of another one. We are one of 526,000 mortgage borrowers who were put into arrears by their bank, by their mortgage lender. The reason I wanted to speak was because I watched the programme yesterday, and I know Paul Carlier, and without him, I think it's best if he speaks.
Yeah, why don't we do that, Lisa? Why don't we do that, Lisa? We'll ask Paul to talk a little bit.
What I wanted to say was that the FCA wouldn't get involved in our case, even though there was so much evidence of wrongdoing by the bank. And they didn't want to get involved because they wanted to destroy Paul Carlier. And they wanted to use my husband as collateral damage to destroy a decent guy. And Paul has got the emails where they talked about himself. So I can't put it all together coherently. But if Paul wouldn't mind telling the people on this meeting exactly what they did to my husband, Peter, and why, and how they treated Paul himself.
Lisa, we will do that. Just before Paul starts speaking, and Paul, I'm sure you're happy to pick up on the point that Lisa set out for you. Lisa, I've known you for about a year and a half, and you know there have been times when you and I have both been crying on a Zoom, listening to what's happened and understanding what's happened. And I am always so impressed by your determination to carry on fighting. And I know you well enough to know that you are coming from a very, very precious place with all the right motivations in the world. And I can honestly tell you, Lisa, when we put together our document called Faces of Financial Crime, the suffering caused by the financial industry, I must have thought about you hundreds of times throughout that document, Lisa, because your story and Peter's story is quite possibly the or one of the most horrific cases of the kind of suffering caused by malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, mis-selling, crime by the financial industry or the crooks who operate around the edges of it. And I just cannot begin to tell you how angry I am with you and for you about how badly the regulator let you down. Lisa, are either of your sons at home today?
One is, he works from home, so he's in his office.
Is he in the room next door or nearby? You're not on your own today is what I'm asking.
No, I'm not.
Okay, I want to speak to you straight after this conversation. After this meeting ends, you and I are going to have a phone call, okay?
Oh, okay.
I'll give you a call straight away. I want to pick your brains on something, Lisa, okay? So
okay.
as soon as the Zoom ends, you and I are going to be speaking, Lisa, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. Paul, as succinctly as you can, please, but don't hold back, mate. Just go for it. Explain what really happened.
It's impossible to do justice to Lisa and Peter's case. It would take me probably 2 hours to do it properly. But the long and the short of it was, Peter was diagnosed with ME in December 2012. He had never missed a payment on his mortgage with HBOS, went to the bank in January, and basically told them of his diagnosis, told them he would have difficulty meeting his £1,250 per month mortgage payment, certainly the coming one, and obviously it might present difficulties thereafter. And his words on that call were, and we only got a call recording very late after the bank withheld it, and TLT, their lawyers, also withheld it, denying that he'd ever asked for help or to reduce his mortgage rate. But on that call, when I eventually obtained it, he reveals their diagnosis and says, and therefore I'm seeking your guidance. And they basically lied to him. They told him to take a payment holiday. And we've also got the call recording with the two people where one transferred him to somebody else, and he said they predetermined it, give him a payment holiday. Now, what the payment holiday was, it served to create 3 months of arrears. And they said to Peter, no, take the payment holiday. You've got two options, payment holiday or extension of term. Take the payment holiday, persuaded him. Peter said, won't that create arrears? Yes, it will, but don't worry, we won't chase you for it. And he was reticent because he wanted a lower rate mortgage because there were ones available that would have reduced his monthly payment to about £700 a month, which would have been manageable, given the loss of the income. They kept on with this payment holiday, and then to really nail it, they said, don't worry, after the 3 months, there's more things that we can do. That was an absolute false representation because, and when I got involved in 2017, the bank put forward a position in response to my allegations that, what it is, we were justified because it was the bank policy not to allow mortgage customers in arrears to switch to an alternate product. Great, okay, fine. So you knew that was a policy of the bank and you engineered the arrears in the first place against his wishes. And in FCA MCOBs, as you, if anyone knows it, when the bank is approached by a customer and who is clearly vulnerable or in difficulties, then they have an obligation to put forward a whole raft of considerations and proposals, including specifically to help the customer find a lower rate mortgage product. Whereas they told Peter he had two options. They didn't, and that wasn't one of them. And the option they picked, and obviously they said they offered it to him saying, don't worry, there's more things we can do after the mortgage, the payment holiday, knowing full well that there were less things to do because by taking the holiday, you would then remove yourself from the opportunity of having a payment, a switching product. Now, when I got involved in 2017, the bank was in the process of seeking a repossession order. Peter and Lisa had done the right thing. They'd already submitted a DSAR to the bank in May with the hope to get the full file ahead of the repossession hearing. Lo and behold, the file arrived the day after, 2 months later, and the day after the repossession hearing. The HBOS data team had to confirm to us that they had the data ready to go within 6 days of the receipt of the DSAR, and it was held up and withheld from them by way of an external law firm who had been put in charge of the process. They held it up so that it would not be received by Peter and Lisa in time to help their defence. I raised all of this and dissected everything that had gone on, highlighting the withholding of information, including key calls as well. And I sent that report to Lloyds, and I sent it to the APPG and copied in the FCA. Andrew Bailey's office were involved by the APPG, and shortly thereafter, there was stuff coming out that and that was circulated back to me that I was pursuing an agenda against Lloyds, and I was letting my emotions get the better of me, and that my actions were detrimental to Peter and his mental health. And I made a formal complaint to the FCA that these were smears and completely unfounded, because all I was doing was addressing the actual facts and the evidence, and highlighting that they concealed evidence and these call recordings and everything else. And the emails came from Bailey's office in particular. I'd made a complaint, and I only got these emails last year. I made a complaint to the FCA that they were circulating these spurious and false narratives about me with intent to undermine this case. And I've now got the internal emails that show that these emanated from Andrew Bailey's office, and they were circulated externally. And his conclusions were completely garbage. And but when we got the information and all these previously withheld documents in 2018, we presented them to the Ombudsman and to the FCA. There you go. We can prove everything. We can prove that the FCA, that Lloyds lied to the Ombudsman when defeating a previous complaint. They'd lied to the FCA, they'd lied to the courts as well, and so had their lawyers TLT. And we had it all wrapped. The Ombudsman took 2 months, they had nowhere to go. And I even left the door open to them and said, look, you were misled. The bank didn't disclose all the information. So you, the Ombudsman, were deceived. To try and take away this, or are they going to be too embarrassed to admit they were wrong? Because here it was quite clear that the Ombudsman's previous decision was based upon fraud and deception by the bank in the first place, and false representations made to it. So the Ombudsman eventually came back with the decision that we dismissed this complaint in its entirety without consideration of its merits. An astonishing decision, but that was the only one they could basically get away with, which would enable them to basically avoid reversing their decision, avoid finding in Peter's favour, and make it appear that they just didn't look at it. They found a way not to look at the evidence. When we put it to Andrew Bailey's office, they eventually came back and said, we don't get involved in individual cases. At the same time, still circulating these smears about me, and claiming that I was trying to undermine and prevent a settlement process between Lisa and the bank, even though the proposals that I put forward were, I believe, fair, balanced, and certainly less than that which Peter and Lisa thought that they might be entitled to. So there could be no way that my efforts were doing anything but making it more possible for a resolution. But the bank had no intention of doing it, and Bailey's office saw to it that they would not get involved on the basis that they don't get involved in individual cases. Now, in 2020, the FCA published their findings on abuse of mortgage customers by Lloyds, and this report proved that the FCA knew that Peter and Lisa were one of 529,000 victims of exactly the same process, and that the FCA had been in Lloyds' offices since 2013 investigating this. Lloyds told them in 2014 they put a stop to it. The FCA went back in 2015 have found that the opposite was true. It was still going on, and still on the industrial scale that it had been. And it resulted in the bank coming out with a redress scheme and everything else. But importantly, they were not going to do anything. Thankfully, an HBOS Reading victim was made aware of the plight of Peter and Lisa, and we showed them the evidence, and they agreed to fund or pay their lawyers to take on the case. And within 2 months, I think it was, the lawyers had framed draft particulars and a draft letter that basically summarised all of the points that I had made, all of the evidence I'd obtained and referred to, and all of the issues this represented, plus a couple more that they had also been able to determine, submitted that to Lloyds and the FCA, and within 2 months a substantial settlement was agreed, whereby the bank agreed to basically everything I'd put forward in the previous proposal, and that amounted to the repayment of over 35,000 in arrears that had accrued, the repayment of 135,000 in legal fees that the bank had dishonestly applied to their mortgage account, not just dishonestly, but also to leverage in court proceedings as well. And we understand that Bailey himself had written to Lloyds to desperately try and get them to settle this, because certainly he didn't want this going to court. So, you know, but that was in December 2018, and sadly, during the period, the 5 years of almost 6 years of suffering that Peter endured at this, he had, and I don't think Lisa won't mind me saying this, but on one occasion, Peter attempted to take his own life. Such was the distress that was being caused by this. And anyone who's endured stress for any period of time knows the toll that it takes. British Heart Foundation confirm it's the biggest cause of heart disease and heart attacks. And sadly, a year later, after the settlement, Peter would pass away for a massive heart attack. And I don't believe that it wasn't in significant part due to, you know, the distress that he'd been subject to, and a person who had already diagnosed an illness, you know, to the bank. So it's an astonishing case, and it shouldn't be. But the level of dishonesty by the FCA was truly astonishing. It really was.
Well, thank you for explaining that, and Lisa, thank you again for your bravery and your determination. And let's carry on this conversation, you and I, after this Zoom meeting ends. We'll just stay on the Zoom, Lisa. When everyone else goes, we'll just stay on. Okay. I'd love to have a chat with one of your other sons, by the way. I've never spoken to them. Lisa, we'll come back to that. Sam, you've been patiently waiting there for us. Sam, please take a moment to introduce yourself, and no need to rush. This meeting today is going in a direction I didn't expect it to go in, but it's going in an important direction, and it's very much in keeping with what we're all about. So, Sam, what would you like to tell us? Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think I speak for everyone here. Lisa, my heart goes out to you, and well, I'm in tears. My heart goes out to you. So I wanted to change the subject ever so slightly. I've been a little bit concerned about some of the language used from one of the earlier speakers, and also someone on Facebook today, on the Facebook group today, who spoke of the idiots. And the idea that we should all be better educated is a similar idea to women shouldn't walk on their own at night for fear of being raped. I'm sorry, but it is. I think it is a dangerous thing to suggest that although financial education, it sounds great, we should all be made aware, we should all be this, we should all be that. We will not be. It is not our fault when we are scammed. Some of us might be more capable than others of doing the research and so on, but clearly it will happen, and it's not our fault. So stop blaming us. And also, I would also like to say that using 3-letter, 4-letter, 5-letter abbreviations all the time, please remember, and I suppose I'm addressing myself to all the professionals, in the room, when talking to those of us who are not in your world, please please say the words, the individual words. It is not difficult. I do not understand what MBOS or whatever all the other letters that have been bandied around mean. And I suppose finally, we're not idiots. We had the money in the first place to invest, and in my case, I think I might be the only person saying this, but I did quite well out of an earlier Blackmore Bonds investment scheme. So I wasn't being greedy. I didn't invest the whole lot a second time. They rang me up and basically said, you know, really happy for you, well done. Would you like to invest again? And I thought, yeah, but I thought still not doing it all. So I only invested a chunk of the, I was just about to say winnings. It is like a lottery, isn't it? The interest that I had made, and obviously I lost all of that. So I know I'm lucky. A, I didn't lose as much as most of the rest of you, and B, it hasn't ruined my life. That's not to say I'm really rich, but I could afford to have lost the £2,000 or £3,000. I would like it back. But that doesn't mean to say that I feel smug, and I do feel a certain amount of, and hear a certain amount of smugness in one of the speakers earlier, a professional, and one of the members of the Facebook group. We do not deserve that, and I think we should call it out when we see it.
Sam, I completely support what you set out. I completely support what you set out. I have a question for you, Sam, and don't answer if you don't want to. It's going to be a little bit precise. When you from what you've explained, you transferred money from, if you like, one generation of Blackmore Bond to another. Did
No.
they? No.
No, it was a second, completely different investment.
Did they send you? Did they send you your original capital to you? Did it go to your bank and then you put it somewhere else, or did they move it from one place to another? Do you remember?
Yes, they sent it to my bank.
Okay.
And then they rang me sometime later and said, "Hi, you were a previous investor with us."
The reason I ask, it clearly does not apply in your case, but sometimes what Ponzi schemes do is they make out you've made a lot of money in one generation of investment, and then they trick you into transferring it into another one after you've been lied to and led to believe that you've made a lot of money, but in actual fact it's just a Ponzi scheme. It's just a paper amount of money. But Sam, thank you very much for explaining that. I know Mark Bishop put his hand up very quickly when he started talking. I think Mark wants to respond to something you said. Mark, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I do want to respond to what Sam said. Firstly, to say thank you for saying it. I think it was, brave of you to come into this forum, as a first-time visitor, I think, and make that point. The second
I'm not brave,
is
just saying it like it is.
Yeah, and I think that's good. And I liked also your analogy about, is a woman out at night or in a short skirt, is she somehow asking for it? The question I would have as a man is, if I found a young woman, in the gutter at night, clearly intoxicated with drink, drugs, or both, wearing not very much, what are my options? Number one, put her in the recovery position and phone an ambulance. Number two, rape her and leave her, lying in a gutter. I think we all know which the right thing is to do. We also know which the wrong thing is to do and what the consequences are of doing the wrong thing. The problem we have here is that some people spot the opportunity to do the wrong thing, and they think that there probably won't be consequences, and they're probably right. That actually is the problem that we've got in a nutshell. And we don't solve that problem by blaming the victims. Yes, of course, you can give a woman a rape alarm. Yes, of course, you can give young women, for example, away at university for the first time, advice about having a designated person who stays sober to look after the rest. You can do all of those things. But actually, when it comes down to it, what you've got to deal with is the behaviour of the lowest common denominator person who will act badly if they think they can get away with it. Now, this victim blaming actually is part of the culture that I have perceived at the FCA. I'll tell you briefly why I'm involved in this campaign. In 2012, I found out that a scheme I'd invested in was a fraud. All the money was gone. And this scheme was very much this type of thing, you know, low risk, guaranteed, 8% per year return. And it was not something run by some wide boys out of some, you know, dodgy serviced office. It was promoted by the financial services arm of Capita PLC. It's the thing called Connaught, which Tim Thomas mentioned. So it was a product promoted by a FTSE 50, operated by a FTSE 50 company. It was available only to sophisticated professional and high net worth individuals. And unlike Blackmore, they didn't try and game that in any way. They promoted it through legitimate IFAs and they did proper checks. I qualified on all three scores as one of those people, sophisticated professional and high net worth. And when I went to the first creditors committee or creditors meeting, you know, big open meeting for all of the creditors, the other investors that I saw there included several Queen's counsels, a past finance director of a FTSE 100 company, several top solicitors and barristers, a past audit partner of a Big Four audit firm, a past president of the Law Society. These people were not idiots. A little while later, having realised that what happened to us was not an exclusive event, but that it was systemic and caused by poor regulation, I tried to persuade the FCA to improve certain things. For example, better treatment of whistleblowers' evidence and treatment of whistleblowers. Not an unreasonable ask, because in the Connaught case, it could have been prevented if they'd listened to a credible, highly credible whistleblower. And I find that, by the way, no chief executive of the FCA has ever agreed to meet with me to discuss my ideas. But one of them, after a certain amount of bullying from me, said I could meet with one of his direct reports. So I went in to meet a fairly senior individual in the FCA. I'm not going to name that individual because they're not here to defend themselves. I went in there, I put forward this proposal. He had his feet on the table, he was picking his nose. He twice failed to turn up for meetings because he'd had to reschedule even when I'd been en route. He was not interested. And he said, yeah, but of course, there is another way of looking at this. You know, really, these people were greedy, weren't they? They were fools. And I basically let him have it with both barrels. And I said, if you say that in a public forum, I'll end your career, because that's untrue. You're talking about the following. I listed those professionals. Are you calling all of those people idiots? They're not idiots. You know, there was a really interesting exchange in the chat here, which was that somebody said, well, actually, it's not about the outsized returns. That's not why they failed. They failed because they're run by greedy people who steal the money. Actually, the returns aren't outsized. You know, if I was to put together a portfolio of low cost ETFs, exchange traded funds, put those in the portfolio, all share UK, all share global, those sorts of things, long run returns from those are probably 8 to 10% per year. That's what they are. There's big, fluctuations within that, but over a 10-year period, high probability of getting that kind of return. Now, these people promise similar levels of return. The reason why they do that is actually, if they promise 50% a year, nobody sane would believe them, They pitch it at a level at which rational people think it could be true, because there were lots of rational people. The actual reason why people get scammed is because they don't have the knowledge or expertise or the time to do due diligence. They'd have to do extensive due diligence. They'd probably have to go in and raid the office actually to find out if it's a scam. The other reason why is that they believe that we have a system of financial regulation and of criminal prosecution that works. They think these people couldn't possibly be scamming because financial services are regulated. And if they were scamming, the regulator would do something about them. And those, unfortunately, are the cognitive errors. So in time, what you could do is you could educate the entire population to say, financial services regulation in the UK is rubbish. Don't trust any financial firm. But what you'd actually be doing in that case is destroying the financial services industry, the legitimate majority of firms, because you'd be saying, don't trust any of it. The alternative, which seems to me far more rational, is to campaign to fix the financial services regulatory regime. And that's really what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Mark. Very well said. Sam?
Just finally, yes, I do agree. I don't feel brave at all. I think to be brave or courageous, you need to be nervous. And life's too short to be nervous. I just want to finally do a reverse of that analogy. There was a wonderful punk poet called Attila the Stockbroker. And back in the 80s, one of his early points was there was a judge who had thrown a rape case out of court because he said it was her fault she was wearing a short skirt. So he had said, well, he had been going around banks at chucking out time and robbing them all. He said it was their fault. They work in the banking industry. They wear smart suits. They're asking for it, which was quite funny at the time. I guess you had to be there. Thank you, Andy, for putting Attila the Stockbroker on the chat. Absolutely. Glad you all know him. Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for
Sam.
today. Really, really interesting. 2 hours.
Yeah, it has been. We had a fascinating press conference type meeting early today at 10 o'clock, Sam. That went really well. We had all kinds of journalists talking about the Panorama programme. So many people speaking so positively. Parliamentarians, journalists, very informed people saying it's hopefully going to make a difference. I really do hope that. I really do believe that, and we'll certainly carry on working to make that the case. Does anybody have anything they are itching to say before we bring the session to a close? By the way, we have another one of these at 6 o'clock today. So if your appetite for TTF related stuff hasn't been filled, then you can come back at 6 if you want. Does anybody have anything else? Otherwise, we'll bring things to a close. I think I'll just check on gallery view to make sure nobody's waving at me. Okay, we will bring things to a close. Oh, Sue Flood. Sue, lovely to have you with us. I'd be very keen to hear what you have to say, Sue. Please fire away. Thank you, Sue. Take yourself off mute first of all.
Hi, thank you to everybody. Mark Bishop, excellent presentation. Paul Carlier for all his hard work, and yourselves in achieving what you did last night for Panorama programme. As those on here may not know, I'm a victim who had a breakdown. I did all of my due diligence. I've sat with the FCA, who explained thoroughly that there was nothing much that I could have done, that bar take some financial exams to educate myself to what I'd employed a financial advisor to do for me. My conversation is to the gentleman that's just left the forum. I don't know if you're still here, the one who's written a book on dealing with financial industry. We have to be very mindful when dealing with victims, in particular, the terminology, idiot, gullible, a sucker born every minute. We as victims already feel those things, and it's extremely difficult to have that pointed out to you on this sort of forum. So I would just ask that people be mindful that we are not financial advisors, we are not educated, and no amount of education will bring you to the situation to deal with serious organised crime. This is serious organised crime that's been going on under the noses of our regulatory bodies, and top-down systemic failure has facilitated that. That's it. Thank you, everybody.
You made that point superbly well, and so you've motivated me to talk about something else, which I'll do now. I've just put into the chat the document we produced that we presented in Parliament. We presented in Parliament about a month ago. It's our research on the faces of financial crime, suffering caused by the financial sector, and we decided to put a lot of pictures into it. At the front of the book, I'll put it here. So it's a real thing. It's obviously the electronic copy, but here's the real thing. So it's a decent piece of work. We're actually very proud of it. As far as we know, it's the first real attempt to actually try to show the human cost and suffering. At the front of the book, we've got people who are the victims of the kind of malpractice and fraud and mis-selling and scamming that we've been talking about. Every one of these pictures has been chosen for a reason, every single one of them. This one here, the lady at the grave side, just gets to me every time I think about it. And some of these pictures are very, very powerful. And I can promise you, every single one of those pictures I can relate to with a member, one member or another of the Transparency Task Force. You know, the children of somebody who's passed away, the wife here that you can just see her legs, the wife here who's absolutely irate, understandably, at her husband who's just told her that he's lost X thousand pounds in a scam. That's what, to my mind, that picture portrays. The elderly gentleman here in the hospital, the poor lady up here who's in an ambulance and she just had a heart attack. Every one of these pictures tells a story. I'm actually showing you this not so much to talk about the pictures of the victims, but to talk about the victims of the culprits. So at the back of the book, we've got these pictures. And in some of the pictures, you've got individuals who are quite obviously, meant to look like dodgy characters. Here's an example. You know, you've got an online scammer who's wearing a mask that's clearly meant to be representing a crook. Obvious. But what about these people here? Yeah, these people in the top right-hand corner of that page, they all look like perfectly respectable people. With my imagination, these are a group of executives in a bank somewhere talking about the promotion of something. It could be toxic interest rate hedging products or PPI or some other horrific bank-based product. You know, they don't look like crooks, but they bloody well are. They damn well are. So let's not fall into the traps, folks, that people have got to be wearing hoodies or looking like a dodgy mafia type guy here or the bloke with a balaclava. What about this innocent looking lady at a seminar? So many people have ended up buying crap financial products that were never going to deliver value for money through various seminars of one kind or another. Sue knows exactly who I've got in mind when I show that picture. You know, let's not fall into the trap that people have to look like criminals to be criminals. This bloke in the telesales room, you know, that's the kind of boiler room that people are talking about. This guy here with a blue suit, so sharply dressed, you know, a banker. Let's not forget, folks, that the global financial crisis led to 10,000 people committing suicide as a direct consequence of malpractice by the financial industry. And that global financial crisis was not caused by the kind of scammers that we're talking about or have been talking about today. It was caused by the scammers that operate in great big office blocks in major cities around the world, who carry out massive, widespread, industrial scale scamming by the financial sector. And just to drive this point home, because I'm getting annoyed, if you go to Violation Tracker, I know that many of you have seen this before. If you go to Violation Tracker UK, which I'll get to the chat in a moment, if you go to Violation Tracker, and I'm going to share my screen. Where is it? Here we go. And you put in a search, other summaries, parent industry totals. What it shows you is that the financial industry is the most egregious industry of them all, fined much more and prosecuted much more than any other industry by a long, long way. And then you click on the financial services words to get the detail. And what you'll find is massive, widespread, systemic mis-selling, malpractice, malfeasance, financial crime, etc., brought about by banks and major financial institutions. So I wholly support the narrative that Sam South introduced to the conversation, and that's just been supported by Sue Flood. The people that did Lisa's petering, you know, weren't wearing balaclavas. There were people in a bank somewhere, and that's the point I'm trying to make as firmly as I possibly can. Lisa, please stay on. You and I need to chat, and I'd love to be introduced to your son, if you don't mind, if he's in the house. I'd just love to say hello. We'll wrap it up there, folks. Come back at 6 o'clock if you want to. Thank you so much for the session. Can I please invite us all to give ourselves collectively a round of applause for putting the time and effort to try to make the world a better place as we can. You know, we can't fix it all, but we can try, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. Thanks, folks.